Thank you, John, and thank you, Lisa. We appreciate so much this opportunity to be with all of you. I was joking with Amira that we're traveling to Oregon. And so this is the first time I've ever been in Oregon. And so that's pretty cool that we have this opportunity to showcase the work that we're doing in Pennsylvania, but also to inform the work on a national scale, to inform the work that you all are doing in your respective areas and regions. And so with that, our title is Equity Bedrock, Setting Conditions at Tier 1. And throughout the session, you're going to see things that might make you chuckle a little bit, but it's a little bit of the play on words of equity bedrock. And we're not joking about the fact that bedrock, the foundational pieces that make equity strong, is where we need to focus. And that bedrock is essentially at the Tier 1 universal level. So I'm going to indicate what we would like for you to gain from today's session. And that is to focus on implementing culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. Our focus for today's session, while albeit at Tier 1, will focus on literacy. And my colleague Amira, I consider her an equity and literacy guru, and so I'm excited to hear from her around those content topics. We'll also talk about 5 culturally responsive teaching strategies that we hope you'll be able to take away even after you leave this session and turn around or think about turning around tomorrow. One of the things in the sessions that we do is to really think about actionable intentions. So, what can you take from what you learn and actually apply right away? Another cool thing that we've embedded here, you'll notice Fred Flintstone and family. If you do remember the Flintstones, Bedrock was the town that they lived in. And so throughout our session, we'll have opportunities for you to put items in the chat if we pose a question. And so we're giving you the time of the theme song to do that. So when you hear this, and hopefully my sound will share, let's make sure before I do that. Let's see. Let me make sure I can share sound. Ooh. We'll pause for now, but you'll get the full time when we have those opportunities. So if you remember the song, you can sing it. It will be stuck in your head the rest of the day, guaranteed. And
That's
Amira, I'm turning it to you.
Thank you, Nikole. So whenever Nikole and I share, we always like to provide a quote that kind of grounds us in the conversation that we'll be having for the day. And so today we chose a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it says, "An individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity." And so this really resonated with me, and it made me think of the word Sankofa that comes from languages native to the people in Ghana. And it means to go back and get. And for the people in Ghana, they say, it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. And I think sometimes when we consider our most marginalized students, our students that are representative of BIPOC communities, and that means Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and also students with disabilities and students who are a part of the LGBTQIA community, sometimes they're forgotten about. And we want to make sure that at that bedrock, at the point of Tier 1, the foundation of what you're doing in your schools, you're considering all of your students. And that's a bit of what we want to talk about today.
And so, who are we? So, John was able to give an introduction of what we do and the great work that we hope we're getting out to the field. But we wanted to give you a little bit more insight into who we are. So, as we said, my name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant for the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. In our state, people say Patton or Patan. So, whichever you feel comfortable doing, you may do. I'm a certified school psychologist by training. I'm an alum of Millersville University and Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I'm a wife. Shout out to Ron, who's on the call. I'm a boy mom to CJ, who hopefully is listening too. I'm an only child to Yvonne, who hopefully is listening too, and a Virgo. And I live near Hershey, Pennsylvania. So technically, I'm in Harrisburg, which is the capital city of Pennsylvania, but I'm also very close to the sweetest place on earth. So if you have a Hershey kiss or Mr. Goodbar, it all came from us.
I love that. Thank you, Nikole. And my name is Amira Hill-Yancy, and I like to say Amira Hill-Yancy, ABD. I'm currently completing my dissertation, and so that's very exciting for me. I'm a girl mom. I'm also mom to a Yorkie. I am a special education teacher, a reading specialist, and I am a hip hop connoisseur. And so just wanted to share really quickly. Oftentimes, when people hear the word hip hop, they think gangster rap. They sometimes there's this negative connotation. And I just wanted to share really quickly that hip hop can be a catalyst for engagement for students. And so, just really quickly, if you're on the line and you're an English teacher, I want you to think about using hip hop when you do your figurative language lesson, your unit on figurative language. And if you teach mathematics, think about hip hop when you're doing a lesson on statistics or proportion or probability. Also, equations or expressions. If you teach social studies, hip hop can be used in when you consider the social construct of ciphers, this concept of ciphers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I discuss reality pedagogy. If you're a history teacher, consider the history of the culture of hip hop. If you teach science, you may want to allow for alternative responses. Could you imagine students responding to the scientific method in a rap? And then if you teach Spanish, also consider the research on the impact of Latinx or Hispanic people on the culture of hip hop. So just a couple of little tidbits to drop on you before we actually get into our content today. All right, Nikole.
Amira cracks me up. She just had to put it in there. I love it. So, as we're thinking about what is equity, I think it's important for us, at least, to ground all of you that may not be from Pennsylvania in how we define equity. And one of the things that we've learned about this work is that equity can be really hard to understand for some people, and it's very contextual. And so, grounding yourself in a definition that makes sense in your context is really critical. And so, what's in front of you is the definition that has been adopted by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, which states that every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, the categories go on. The two that are missing and will be added are religion and gender identity. And so, we want to be very cognizant that what we're talking about here is that key word of access. And so, as we think about what access means, it doesn't just mean to technology or to Wi Fi. It's access to content, it's access to curriculum, it's access to a positive school climate where students are psychologically, emotionally, and socially safe. And so, as we consider that term around this equity definition, be thinking about what access means in your particular context. In addition to that, now that we've had a grounding definition, why do we need to even focus on equity? And for some people, there's an assumption that inequities are maybe in one particular district, in one particular part of the state, around a certain group of individuals, etc. I would argue, and statistics have shown, that inequities are vast and they cover many different components that extend beyond the educational space. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of them for you to just again ignite you to think about how that definition can have an impact in the work that you're doing, particularly at that bedrock level of tier one. So, when we think about societal inequities, those are things like biases that society frames for us, the messages that were sent, and that we maybe unconsciously or consciously have decisions made around. We talk about assessment inequity. I'm a school psychologist by training. So, as I think about the students that I evaluated and perhaps maybe misidentified because of bias that was built into those assessment practices, identifying them for special education or not identifying them for gifted placement, those are inequities that happen perpetually without us even necessarily knowing that that's at play. And so I won't take the time to go through each one because we want to get into digging deep into those five practices, but just articulating how inequities are vast and they're systemic. And so, in order to make change, you have to address the system first. So, what does the field say about equity? In the work that Amira and I do in our state, these are some of the things that we hear from counterparts that do this work and also from people that are trained by us. And so we thought it was important to showcase this with all of you because it may be things that you've heard as well in your work. One of which that I've heard a lot is we are a rural school district. We're not very ethnically or racially diverse, so there's no need to talk about equity. Why are you training us on that? And my argument to that is that equity does not live in one dimension. And so, as we think about the different students that we have in our classrooms, they present with intersecting identities. So, even if you don't have a homogeneous, or I should say a heterogeneous racial or ethnic makeup, you have students who are homeless, you have students of low socioeconomic status, you have students who have all different types of things that they bring to the table that creates the space for equity. Think back to that definition from Pennsylvania, where we're talking about addressing all of those different identities at that right moment. MTSS provides the framework for that. We need a keynote to address equity, and then we can check the box that we train the staff. I hear this a little bit too often, I would say, and especially now we're coming off of the racial reckoning summer. We're coming and dealing currently with COVID-19, and so equity really has had a spotlight shown on it. Equity is not new. It's just now receiving the attention that's necessary and the awareness. And so often, in response to that, we have a lot of people who, our colleague in the other session, Floyd Cobb, says that we have people who are equity passionate, but not always equity competent. And I think that's important to note. We want to build competency, not just be excited to want to do something to check the box off, but the competency to sustain those efforts. Isn't equity only about special education? This goes back to that categorizations that people do around equity, and that's not appropriate. It extends beyond. Those intersecting identities extend beyond. And we do things fairly and by the book. So when we talk about things like PBIS or codes of conduct, etc., sometimes that's the pushback when we talk about perhaps differentiated consequences or approaches to make sure that all students have an equitable opportunity to receive certain outcomes. And so, in response to those inequities and the things that we hear in the field, the Pennsylvania Department of Education released in September of 2020 the PDE Equitable Practices Hub, which we will provide in the chat before we end today. And as we consider how we can support dismantling inequities in our systems, the equity pillars of practice are outlined here. For purposes of time, I'm not going to go through each one, but I do want to highlight that each of these are non-sequential, non-linear. However, depending on where you are as a system in your equity journey, so for instance, thinking of the tier 1 bedrock that we want to highlight, self-awareness may be your entry point. For others of you, it might be family and community engagement. For another group, it may be general equity practices like hiring practices or adopting frameworks like PBIS or MTSS. The focus of today's session will be mainly around academic equity, and that's where Amira and I will talk about moving systems from system-wide lenses to classroom lenses. We also want to be clear on what are the key tenets of MTSS. So from a Pennsylvania lens, you'll see on the right-hand side the logo that represents our Pennsylvania MTSS framework. And over on the left in bullets are the key tenets that we have adopted, which are high quality core instruction, definitely in line with what we're going to cover today. The importance of universal screening. So how are you temperature checking across your system if students are responsive or not? Looking at shared ownership, database decision making, response to intervention as a methodology and not the framework. The framework is MTSS. ORTIi is the mechanism to let us know if our framework is working. Family engagement cannot be understated. And then ongoing professional learning, not the spray and pray where we do a training and say, okay, good, now go forth and prosper, but actually, how do we embed these efforts into everything that we do within our roles? So Dr. Amber Green, who is a colleague of ours from University of Texas at Arlington, said equity is MTSS implementation. The caveat is when done with fidelity. In addition to that, as I sort of turn this over, I do want to highlight Dr. Zaretta Hammond, who really articulates nicely the distinction of equity, because so often we conflate these three things, but we want to be clear on what each one means. And our focus for today will be around culturally responsive education. So that purple side will be where we spend a lot of our effort at that tier one place, that independent learning for agency. And I'm going to turn it to Amira.
Thanks, Nikole. So, as we move from systems to classrooms, that's really where the work occurs. You want to make sure that you have your systems in place. You want to see that the systems are sustainable and allowing classrooms to function in a manner that would allow for culturally relevant pedagogy. So, when we consider how we do this, how we ensure that these things are in place, we have to look at culturally relevant pedagogy. And when we consider pedagogy, we want to ensure that teachers have the professional development, um, and that will allow them to acquire the skills to implement culturally responsive practices in their classrooms. So that includes building academic and social emotional skills, affirming students and their cultural histories, and helping students to recognize, analyze, and address social inequalities and racist policies that may exist. And so you'll see a lot of that now, as Nikole indicated, with the racial awakening that occurred over the summer. So when we have this pandemic and a pandemic that we're dealing with students, you'll hear them voicing their concerns more, and we want to create space for that in our classrooms. Also, we want to make sure that we are going beyond academics with equitable instruction. And equitable instruction includes behavioral and social emotional instruction, and it has to really be integrated in an authentic manner. And so we're giving students the opportunity to work on social emotional skills like problem solving, conflict resolution, and also allowing students to collaborate. And that will lead to students having a safe space for them to be their authentic selves. And in that safe space, they're given the ability and the space to learn and grow. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the 5 culturally relevant teaching strategies. That's what we'll really focus on today. The first is building relationships, activating students' prior knowledge, encouraging students to leverage their cultural capital, make learning contextual, and reconsider your classroom setup. And I think if you consider these strategies, and as we go through them, we are going to encourage you to respond to some questions about the content that we present and really think about how you can implement these things in your classroom. So once we lay them out for you, what can you do to make this a part of your everyday classroom experience for students? Next slide. So we'll start with building relationships. Culturally responsive teaching is about embracing all cultures of students and building a sense of belonging for students in the classroom. And in the words of Miss Rita Pearson, kids don't learn from people who don't like them, even if that's their perception. If kids perceive that you don't like them, they're not going to learn from you because their perception becomes their reality. So building relationships is essential, and that's why it's listed first. So I like this quote. Positive relationships between teachers and students are the bedrock for success in school and beyond. And I couldn't agree more. When students feel a sense of connection and belonging in school, they tend to be more involved in their own learning. And that's what we really want. That is really one of the key tenets of being culturally responsive and actually a part of the reality pedagogy. Students are a part of their own learning, and we want to make sure that we engage them as much as possible. So I like this. I'm into quotes, obviously. The real work is changing the attitudes of adults, that all children can succeed. And I think if adults have deficit perspectives about students, there's no way that you can build a relationship, and there's no way real learning can occur. So we want to always make sure that we keep the bar high, set the bar high, and keep it high for our students. So let's get into key components of building relationships. So, the first thing that we like to cover is knowing yourself and your students. And the first part of that is building a relationship with each student. And that may take some time to do. It's not something that's going to occur overnight, but it's something that should start at the beginning of the school year. And I think a great way of doing that is knowing how to pronounce every student's name and understanding that that's really a crucial part of showing respect for students. I can remember growing up having a 5 letter name that most teachers couldn't pronounce. And when they took the time to make sure that they were pronouncing it correctly, am I saying that right? That really meant that they were trying to show care for me. And I think that that matters a lot when you consider the diverse names that may appear in your roles. You want to make sure that you're saying their names correctly. And also, if they have a preferred name that they like to be called, make sure that that is a part of getting to know your students. The next thing is knowing your own perspectives. We need to always be aware of our biases. And Dr. Kent McIntosh talks about implicit biases and putting in place, looking at vulnerable decision points that occur as a result of implicit biases, and then implementing neutralizing routines to ensure that we're supporting students appropriately. Also, want to make sure that we are aware of our privilege. And that privilege could be white privilege, it could be male privilege, it could be socioeconomic privilege. So we want to make sure that we consider that when we look at our students. It really impacts the lens through which we see all of our students. Also, we want to make sure that we are intentional about learning students' beliefs and their attitudes and their personalities and really how they respond in different situations because it matters and it is based on culture. Um, Also, perspective taking. We want to learn about our students, but students also want to learn about teachers. And so when teachers share about themselves, it really helps to give them perspective and learn, and it also helps students to better understand the similarities and differences in their backgrounds. And I think that allowing students to see teachers as human, teachers as whole, teachers as having vast experiences, teachers as having experiences similar to themselves can make the difference in establishing that rapport and building that relationship. Also, we want to ensure that we use empathy, not sympathy, when we are supporting students. They don't need to be saved. They don't need saviors. They need to be educated. They need to be empowered. They don't need to be saved. When we're supporting our linguistically diverse students, we want to take on these activities to ensure that we are supporting the students as best as possible. And the first is wrap with ESL teachers or interpreters. It's essential to develop relationships and close working relationships with those ESL teachers or those interpreters that are supporting the students that you serve. We do. We know that gradual release of responsibility. I do, we do, you do. But we want to focus on incorporating more group work that allows students to practice tasks, practice their language skills in a more personal, less intimidating setting than in the classroom in front of all the students, in a small group setting as much as possible. Also visualizing, making things as visual as possible for students by writing on the board, using pictures, creating diagrams. Make sure that students can see everything that you're saying. Previews are very important. Allowing English learners and really all of your students to preview materials before a lesson whenever possible is very important. And then silence is golden sometimes. Understanding that some students may experience a silent period as an English language learner if they're learning a new language and it's not something that they commonly speak at home, perhaps there may be a period of time when they're just not talking, and that's okay. Sometimes it's okay to sit in that silence, and you don't need to call on them or force them to speak. Allow them to, as you're developing that relationship, you'll get to know them, they get to know you, and then that comfort level is established. Okay. And next, we talk about families. Often we know that families aren't in our classrooms, our students are, but relationships and the trust that we build with families is essential because what we do at home, when we talk about that person environment fit, we want to make sure that we are doing the same thing and providing supports in school that support what's going on in their home and in their community to make sure that we are minimizing risk factors and increasing the effectiveness of protective factors. So we want to have positive parent teacher relationships, and that can really influence student success. And it's really important for culturally diverse students. Also, maintain positive communication. When we're developing these relationships, you want to make sure that you're talking from a positive perspective, and not every call that they get from you is a negative call. I always started as a special education teacher. I started the school year off with a positive call, and it startled some parents. They would be like, "What did he do now?" And I'm like, "It's the beginning of the school year. Just wanted to tell you how great he is." You can't imagine what they did for developing that relationship with that parent. Also, be child centered. It's all about the kids. My girlfriend always says at 11:59:59, it's about children. Keep the focus on children, not what you think, how you feel, but how we can make sure that this child is successful. Also, the parent is the SME, subject matter expert. That comes from the business world. So we want to always consider the fact that the parents know their children best. Listen to their voice. Be quiet. That's why we have one mouth and two ears, because we need to listen more. Listen to our families, especially of our culturally diverse and culturally and linguistically diverse students. And then be responsive. If they reach out to you, make sure you get back to them as soon as possible with helpful, informative information. So, establishing culturally responsive classroom management, it puts a different lens on what classroom management looks like. And considering your communication style, sometimes as adults, we can be sarcastic, and that may not land well with all students. So we want to make sure that our communication style is positive, our communication style is uplifting, and we're using words that empower students, and they don't we don't tear students down. Clarify expectations by collaborating with students. So we want to explicitly indicate what things should be done and should not be done, what they look like, what they don't look like. And that collaboration with students allows them to bring their voice into what good classroom management is, how the classroom should be run. Also, be conscious of how BIPOC students resolve conflict, and that really makes the difference. There's research done on horseplay, or how Black boys interact, and including horseplay or other forms of resolving conflict or interacting with each other. And we want to make sure that we are aware of those things so that we are not penalizing students from bringing their home culture into the school. Also, I can't emphasize enough creating a positive environment and taking the emphasis off being punitive. We don't want to look at what would happen if you do something wrong, but let's look at it from the perspective of all the things that can happen, all the great things that happen when we're on task. Focus on those things and not punishing students. And then the last thing is have fun. Sometimes we just get caught up in the bureaucracy of testing, state assessments, and having to, be observed by our school leaders. Sit those things aside and really engage with your students and ensure that they see you as human. You're interacting with them regularly and positively. You're empowering them, and you're ensuring that they have a voice in your classroom. Have fun with that. And so we move into our first "What do you yabba dabba do?" So corny, but so much fun for Nikole and I. So at this point in the chat, we'd like you to share successful strategies you use to build positive relationships with students and families. Thank you for engaging us and just looking at some of the comments, positive behavior referrals, student and parent surveys, identity webs like that. Always mirroring what the parental concerns are in your work. Remember what they say they are concerned about and reiterate it when discussing your design, testing, etc. Family interviews or questionnaire asking about their hopes and dreams for their child. I love you, Miss Jackson, Mr. and Miss Jackson. I don't know who that is. Amazing. My favorite. Really
Miss Jackson. It's yeah. With
thank
first grade parents. With
love it.
first grade. Yeah.
Great. That should be done K through 12. Being visible in the community. Yes, yes, yes. Meeting before the school year begins. Absolutely. I share my own story of reading problems. Additionally, I discuss my son. Yes, yes. Those connections are so important. I won't read everything, but those are some really great responses. Thank you guys for engaging us. And we'll do that after each of our sections. Nikole.
Awesome. That was fabulous. Okay. So now we're moving into activating students' prior knowledge. So we've heard about the importance of building relationships, but now in knowing more about our students, we can do a little better, right? So we can activate their prior knowledge when we may be talking about things that perhaps they've never been exposed to or have had a different experience related to what you're discussing. And so, one of the things that I want to highlight, and I'm so excited that Dr. McIntosh is on this call, it's a little nerve wracking, but at the same time, super exciting because this article, he was one of the co authors around. And so, in our PBIS world, we use pbis.org for almost everything as the immediate go-to on the best resources connected to not only implementing PBIS but also safe and positive school climates. And so this particular article focuses on examples of engaging instruction to increase equity in education. And it dovetailed so nicely with activating students' prior knowledge, listing one of those as building and priming that background knowledge. So I'm going to put in the chat let me put it here. Yep, I'm putting the article right now. So you'll be able to access it. But some of the key questions that came out of the article that are really nicely organized around each one of those examples are: do you have a basic understanding of students' cultures and how that might affect their background knowledge or their understanding of new knowledge? How can I relate new concepts to previously taught concepts? So it's really nice in the article, they give you an example of a vocabulary lesson. And in that vocabulary lesson, it's a discussion about summertime and the beach and all of those things. But what it says is that as educators, we need to be cognizant that not everyone goes to the beach. Not everyone has the access to go to the beach. And so those concepts and vocab terms that we're talking about might for students be a totally new thing. And so how can we ensure that we're priming them so that they have that opportunity to be able to engage as much as possible? How can I make sure that these concepts are more relevant? So if the beach isn't relevant, maybe my lesson needs an adjustment so that it's more relevant to the context of what I'm teaching. Now, the beach may be something we teach later. However, at this moment, if I want to hook in my students in a concept, it's best to make sure that it's as appropriate as possible to what they have experienced. And then did I prime instruction by providing information that built on their prerequisite knowledge? So we don't want to go in assuming that they don't know anything. We want to go in with that slate of perhaps I can enhance or build upon that slate, that bedrock that is already there, that came in with them from their experiences with families, from their experiences in their own lives, etc. And so I'm going to turn it to Amira to offer some additional content around this particular area.
Yeah, thanks, Nikole. So, when we consider some of the key components of culturally responsive pedagogy, we can just take a look at a few strategies that we can use to activate background knowledge based on those tenets. So, considering asking students what they know about a topic before beginning the lesson might seem simple, but again, in the example that Nikole provided with the beach, if you ask the question about has anyone been to the beach, then you'll know if your work to establish that concept will need some additional support. Will you need to show some pictures? Will you need to show some video? What else do you need to do to ensure that the students have that idea in their mind? Next is asking students about key concepts. clarify concepts for them where they need it, including misconceptions before even teaching the content. So if there are things that they really don't understand or they don't have a full understanding of, make sure that that's clarified. Putting students in groups or allowing them to choose their groups. Again, really good culturally responsive tool, allowing students to choose. I know sometimes when we think about that, we want to have the control. We know that if these two are together, they're going to do this, but we also want to consider what would happen if we don't give them the choice. And so when we talk about behavioral issues that may arise, sometimes it's as simple as us letting go of that control and allowing students the autonomy to make the decisions for themselves. Throughout a question related to the reading, each group shares what they know or think they know. So again, giving the students the power. Preview text, and then connect everyday experiences with classroom topics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to reality pedagogy, but we really want to make sure that we are bringing the students' worlds into our classroom so that it's not two separate ways, that they see the validity in school because there's a connectedness between what they're learning in school and what's occurring at home.
Perfect. So now we're at what do you yabba dabba do? So please indicate some ways that you've primed background knowledge for your students, and you have the time of the theme song to do that. So, Joshua, yes, you're an evaluator. I picked up right away motivational interviewing. Yes, this is awesome. Some of the other things we saw were using photos, using YouTube, KWL charts, anticipatory sets, four corners. So, Amira, anything else that's picking up for you that you saw? Okay, so thank you so much for doing that. We're going to keep moving for sake of time and turning it over to Amira.
Yes. So next, we're going to talk about encouraging students to leverage their cultural capital. And one key way to help students feel connected is to include their perspectives and their values in the learning experience. And this step is really essential to becoming more culturally responsive. And it's simple, but it's really powerful, and it can get great results in the classroom. So quickly, I'm just going to cover the three types of cultural capital. And the two that really matter most are the embodied and the objectified. And so parents transmit their cultural capital to children, either knowingly exposing them to the objectified and embodied cultural capital in their home, or by actively investing in transmitting it to their students. So it can happen both passively and actively. The institutionalized cultural capital is something that we won't consider just because it's based on educational credentials. So when we talk about cultural capital, and we can go to the next slide, Nikole, it's imperative that we talk about Dr. Chris Emdin's reality pedagogy. And if you have ever heard of the book For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too, that was penned by Dr. Chris Emdin. He has a new book that'll be out this summer called Ratchetdemics. I highly recommend it. But reality pedagogy is based on 5 tenets. And the first of those is cogenerative dialogues. And earlier I talked about ciphers. So this reality pedagogy really brings in this concept of hip hop education. And so a lot of what Dr. Emdin talks about, he's a scientist, but he brings in hip hop into everything that he does. And so these cogenerative dialogues are essentially ciphers, structured dialogues that occur in classrooms. And these dialogues occur amongst the students. The next is co-teaching. And it encourages students to be the experts. So it encourages students to be the person to talk about who they are, what's represented in their community, and bring their culture into the classroom. Bring things into the classroom that are essential to their culture, their community, and talk about them and share with them. And it puts the teacher in the position sometimes as a novice because they are the ones obtaining the information that the student is sharing. Cosmopolitanism. Human beings are responsible for each other. And I think this is so important because this philosophical construct of human beings being responsible allows us to see that each of us comes with our own set of structures, cultural norms, and we don't allow anyone to be greater than the other. And each individual difference should be valued and it should be set on a pedestal because we're all important. Next is context. I mean, it allows students to connect their home lives and their culture to the classroom. And I think that is the key of sharing cultural capital. Students are able to bring in those artifacts from home, talk about them, and they become a part of the lesson. So in these cogenerative dialogues, teachers are allowing students to discuss what's going to be included in the lessons. How do they take the lessons and transform them to what the curriculum says they need to do, but what students feel that they need? And then also the content, that willingness of the teacher to acknowledge their limitations. Hey, I know a lot about pedagogy. I went to school to, learn to teach English, but now what can you bring to the lesson to make the lesson relevant to you? How can you infuse the curriculum, students, with what you bring, with what you know, with what you value to make the lesson more digestible and more relevant once you leave the classroom. So reality pedagogy is amazing. If you haven't read the book by Dr. Chris Emdin, I highly recommend that. Next slide for me, Nikole. So just want to make sure that we're encouraging students, challenge students, and sometimes teachers don't feel comfortable with doing this, but I challenge you, if you really want to know how you're doing, don't look to your principal, look to your students. Ask them, do you know how students feel in your classroom? Do you know what their experiences are? Are they able to see themselves in the curriculum? Who is centered? What groups are centered? Want to make sure that you're providing student guided, culturally mediated instruction. Again, bringing the students into the lessons, allowing them to plan, making sure that their cultural capital is front and center. Employee cooperative learning. Cooperative learning is key to being culturally responsive, ensuring that students are learning together, they learn and grow from each other. And it's not, again, about not putting students together who you think might cause a behavioral issue, but allowing them that autonomy to do that. And then use technology. Children today, as young as 2, my 2-year-old can use the iPhone better than I can. We as teachers, we are immigrants to the technology age. Children today are born into it. They know more than us, and we need to step our game up when it comes to technology. All right, next slide, Nikole. So, what do you yabba dabba do? Please share a strategy you will add to your arsenal. All right, so we have students as co-teacher, love that. Comments, questions, and concerns box, yes, love it. Allow students to be experts, awesome. Whole space for contributions, connections to the unit of study. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much. Keep adding to the chat box. And Nikole, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Amira. So, our next strategy is make learning contextual. So, right in line with what Amira just covered. And how can you do that? I mean, it sounds easy, but truly, what can you do to make it happen? So we're not going to do yabba dabba do with the music because we're moving on time, but I would like you to answer this question for me. If you could think about your level of comfort with having conversations among peers, so folks like us, peers and adults, friends, with topics around race, politics, gender, sexual orientation on a scale to 1 to 5, 1 being highly uncomfortable and 5 being very uncomfortable. And you can do some halves if you want to. Start putting those numbers in the chat for us. And thank you for your honesty and just vulnerability in some of these responses. We appreciate that. And again, this is around peers, so even coworkers, people that you encounter on a regular basis. We're getting a lot of 4s. Someone said outside of work a 5. Totally understood. So context is really critical, right? So when we think about when we are talking to peers and how comfortable we are having those conversations, now I want you to think about if you're talking to students. So when you're talking to students about race, politics, gender, sexual orientation, same scale. Okay, we're seeing some 1s, highly uncomfortable to very uncomfortable. Some are at 5, some are at in betweens, 2.5 to 3. As a first grade teacher, a 2. I think that's another important context, knowing the audience and how to approach some of these difficult and what I would call brave conversations. Absolutely. So as we think about that, why we're tying that to making learning contextual is exemplified in what you put here. The important part to remember, though, is that our students are our main audience, and we have an obligation to ensure that we're creating self-regulated learners that can engage in civil discourse. And so the topics that are bulleted for you are just those things. And we'll talk more about that in 1 second. So after the January 6th insurrection at our nation's capital, formerly Teaching Tolerance, which is now learningforjustice.org, promoted an article called When Bad Things Are Happening. And they offered a 4-step process. And that's one of the things I really like about learningforjustice.org. If you've not ever visited their website, definitely recommend you do so. They offer clear guidance and steps for you to really think about if you have to engage in conversations that we just saw are really difficult. And so 1 is to listen. As simple enough. So when we have students coming together, whether they're in virtual spaces or brick and mortar spaces, and something has happened nationally or locally, etc., let them guide. If they want to talk about it, it's really not our place to say, let's not have that discussion. We may not feel comfortable, but obviously there's a need to have a dialogue. So listening is so critical. Number 2 is to protect. So as you're thinking about your role as educators, our natural inclination is to protect our young people. And so in protecting them, we're engaging them and helping them understand what is valid news, what might not be valid news, how do we articulate the difference between the two, and ensure that we're protecting students from some of those things that might inadvertently harm them by misleading them. Number 3 is to model. So, as we're having discussions and maybe there's some despair around what may have happened as we saw after January 6th, how can we as educators model taking that anger, taking that sadness, and changing the narrative to what it is we can do to change the system? Lending voice to that, allowing them to see that there's some options that they can consider. And then number 4, take care of yourself. So we've indicated how we feel, like how our bodies feel, how we mentally feel when we're in the midst of these conversations. Taking care of yourself, self-care is something you're hearing all the time, but it's so true. Securing your oxygen mask so that you can be whole when you're engaging with young people is extremely critical to this effort. And so, what are some strategies as we consider what Amira has highlighted for us, and as we consider literacy and reading of books and engaging in conversations that speak to different texts, etc.? How can we use something like personal reflection prompts to help students make relevance to what's going on around them? So, just some key questions. I won't read these all out for you, but what inspires or upsets you about the text? How can you make the text make sense in your particular experience or community? What do you want to change as a result of reading the text? And how do you see these issues in your school and neighborhood? In addition to that, the critical practices of connecting to current events cannot be understated. So, again, I know it can be uncomfortable. I know it can be charged when you're having conversations like this, but we have that obligation to do right by our students, to empower them and engage them in these processes. And then allowing for service learning and social action projects. Remember that modeling and that four-step process of listen, protect, model, and take care of yourself? The modeling is taking students out of their comfort zones in some cases, or out into their own communities, and doing some of that service learning and having exposure for them that they may not necessarily get, which takes us back to activating and priming that background knowledge.
Awesome, Nikole. Thank you. So, as we consider, as Nikole stated, how we engage with text, we really want to start with reconsidering your classroom setup and thinking about what it looks like to walk into your classroom. What does it look like to walk through your classroom before school has begun? What do students see on the walls? What do they hear? What welcomes them? And these spatial elements are important and set a clear tone even before the bell has rung. And so we'll go to the next slide. So here are just a few ways to adjust the culture in your classroom so that students are getting what they need and you're creating a space that welcomes learning, that welcomes all students regardless of their cultural background. So arranging your classroom to encourage students to be able to discuss and engage in cooperative activities is essential. And so it could be a circular or semicircular seating setup. Start off with communicating high expectations for students. We don't ever want to lower the bar, even if you haven't gotten to the point where you can shift your perspective of thinking that all students can excel in school. You want to make sure that you keep those expectations high for them. Reshaping the curriculum, that's where you're bringing student voice in. That's where you're looking at current events and you're looking at things that are going on that impact the students who come into your classroom on a regular basis. And you're not doing the curriculum, you're making sure that you keep up with that, but you're adding to it to ensure that it provides what students need so that they are engaged and they understand the relevance of school. Because it's the worst thing is for students to come to school each day and not see themselves and not feel connected to school and not feel that school is important. So we want to make sure that the curriculum includes components that support students coming to school regularly and being engaged in school. Also, designing lessons that facilitate safe and respectful sharing. And so students want to engage, especially students that come from diverse backgrounds. If you feel comfortable being like the sage on the stage where you stand there and you just talk to the students and you share all that you know, you are going to be highly unsuccessful in classrooms today. And so the teacher typically should take on more of a facilitator role. Now, when you're providing new content, you want to make sure that you use direct instruction strategies to share new concepts. And you can also do things like have individual reflections for students, as Nikole indicated, but also interactive discussions, especially now that we're in a virtual environment, peer question and answer sessions, connecting new learning to concepts is key. And so Nikole talked about activating that prior knowledge, but you want to make sure that once you have that hook, you're adding something onto it for students. And then intentional read alouds. I learned the power of read alouds for high school students as a secondary English teacher. I started out with a book by Hill Harper, Letters to My Sister, that my aunt purchased for me. And it was just like a do now activity that I started each morning. And I read, and then they had to respond to a question. Well, when I was done with all the letters in the book, I sort of went on to another type of activity, and they were sitting there looking at me like I had five heads. And I'm like, what's going on, ladies? It was an all girls school. They're like, what happened to our read aloud? And I found the power of engaging students in read alouds. And so those intentional read alouds where you're thinking aloud and you're sharing your thinking and how to process information with students is important. And it really doesn't matter what age they are. Students really get a lot from read alouds. Next slide. So Books are kind of a big deal. I mean, books are a big deal no matter what subject, whether it be English, math, science, social studies. We need books, and students need to have stories that look like, that include characters, that include people who look like themselves. And so, this quote from Amiri Baraka, and I won't read it, but essentially, we want to be able to embrace our humanity, but we need to see ourselves. And so, this concept of mirrors, windows, sliding glass doors, and so much more by Dr. Rudine Bishop really gives us a good idea of how big of a deal books are. And we'll go to the next slide. So books can be mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, but there's so much more. And you can see on the slide the ways in which books can impact students. And so I'll read this quote. Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created and recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as a part of the larger human experience. And so when we consider mirrors, students need to see themselves in text, windows. They need to be able to look out and see others. And then sliding glass doors. It allows students to go back and forth. So they see characters or they see experiences that are like their own, but then they intertwine with those of others. And that's so important. Oftentimes, students that are represent as BIPOC don't get to see themselves as much as the majority culture in text. And so we want to make sure that our libraries are varied and we're including texts that have characters and stories, biographies that represent all of the students that are in front of us on a regular basis. And we will go to the next slide. So when we are um, adding to our libraries and we are giving the students the opportunity to have mirrors, we want to make sure that we avoid the single story. And essentially, the single story is the stereotype. The single story is getting information about, for example, Black people and reading about slavery, or only seeing one side of it and not seeing the agency in slaves in fighting for their own freedom. Making sure that we are not providing this monolithic view of groups of people, that we see the varied lived experiences of the students that are represented in your classrooms. And avoiding enforcing this single perspective of who people are. And so here I just share for you 4 types of multicultural books: consciously interracial, people are people books, distinctive experience books. And under that, you want to make sure that if students are experiencing or have had experiences or are a part of certain communities, you want to include texts that include them as well. So gendered challenging texts, honoring disability, hunger, poverty, and homelessness. Those things, you may not feel the most comfortable talking about them, but as Nikole stated, it's not our right to say no. So we want to make sure that the students have access. And then coping books. So as we consider those types of books, share any adjustments to your classroom culture through multicultural texts that you might want to consider. And while you're typing in the chat, we are going to slide over to actionable intentions. And so, in actionable intentions, we really just want you to take away things, as Nikole indicated at the start, things that you can do tomorrow. So for professional staff, consider what do you have in place to build relationships with all students and families? What do you need to improve upon when activating students' background knowledge and leveraging their cultural capital? What new learning will you take away from today's session about making learning more contextual? And how will you reconsider your classroom setup? So, based on the concepts that we shared today, what are you going to do differently? What has impacted you in a way that you want to do something different? You need to do something different when considering your students.
Absolutely. So, from a leadership or administrator lens, thinking about those same questions, but applying a slightly different lens, because we know administrators, they have a different role altogether. And so, as you're thinking of being that Johnny on the spot, if you will, where everything comes to you and you have to make quick decisions, it's important that you think about your larger system. And so, how will you support staff to build capacity to leverage their culturally responsive sustaining practices? So, as Amira said, at the professional staff section, we've offered you some different ideas that are culturally responsive and sustaining in nature. How will you ensure that those things are carried out by the teachers in your building, by the other staff in your building, et cetera? And how will you also model it? And then, how will you continue to embed equity into your bedrock? You are the leaders. You make the bedrock sustain, you make the bedrock function. And if the bedrock is not strong, we know a house on sand cannot stand. And so it's important for us to ensure that that foundation is solid as possible. And so that bedrock needs to be there. And equity is that foundational bedrock. So as we think about tier one, these practices at the classroom level inform overarching universal practices that inform and impact all students. And so, what we like for you to do as we sort of wrap up is to ask you to do a Mentimeter. And if you're not familiar with Mentimeter, I really love it because it's one of those things that allows us to kind of interact with you without necessarily forcing you to do too much in the chat. So, let me get out of this for 1 second and take us to Mentimeter. And hopefully you are still seeing my screen. Yay, okay. So if you go to www.menti.com and use the code 1334701, and John or Lisa, if you are in the chat, if you could put that link in the chat, www.menti.com, and the code, we are asking for you to describe one action you'll take after today's session. And in a moment, we should start to see those populate on the screen. And sorry, we don't have Yabba Dabba Doo to play while you're doing this one, but you can imagine it. You can sing it to yourself. So we'll just give it a few moments, and we're actually decent on time, Amira. So let's go ahead and give folks time to add that in.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. Listen more, share, reflect, implement. Hmm. What you'll notice with Mentimeter, if you've not used it before, is that the larger words reflect numerous responses that were the same. So reflect tends to be the word that a lot of people are choosing.
And that's so important. I mean, when we
Mhm.
consider self awareness, we really need to look at ourselves, what we're bringing to the table, what we're doing, and how we're impacting our students. So, listening and reflecting being the largest words on the screen make me so happy.
I'm excited because someone put yabba dabba do something.
See, I thought I saw that, but then, I can't see it anymore. So that was.
Oh, that is so classic. Yes. Difficult conversation, speaking, adapting.
Connect. I like that.
Hmm.
Connect as well.
Focus.
Ask.
There you
Hello.
go. Yep. Let students speak. Ooh, that's big. Allow students to guide.
Right.
This
Think.
is awesome.
Engage. Love it.
So we have about 40 people that have done this, and we know we have over 100. We are so excited to have over 100 people. That's phenomenal. So we're
Yeah.
not going to sit and make all 100 plus of you do this, but it does give us a sense of what did connect with you. And as we kind of transition back out of the Mentimeter, and please continue to populate this because we'll be able to capture this and have it as our own formative assessment to let us know how we did. So thank you for that. Let me transition us back to the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. And so I wanted to leave you with a quote as we sort of wrap up today's session and just read it out loud to you because I think for what we've been talking about and kind of where we are as a country in education, this really hit home for me. It comes from Jamila Pitts from Learning for Justice. She says, "This is a time to reapproach and reimagine teaching as a tool for action and as a vehicle for care. And it is important to know that teachers can have the hard conversations and teach the hard lessons while caring for students and caring for ourselves, especially if our students are among the most marginalized and most impacted. This is human work." And so I think that sums up what Amira and I were really hoping to convey to all of you today. We do want to offer our email accounts and I'm sorry, email addresses. If you do have any further questions or just want a thought partner in this effort, we are very open to that. We're so pleased to meet folks from outside of Pennsylvania. So we'll be learning from you as you're hopefully learning from us. Amira, any final words?
Want to say thanks to everyone for your participation in the chat. And we hope that the information that we provided has landed with you in a way that you will consider taking it back to your practice and making those adjustments. And always remembering that students are the purpose of us doing this work. And so, whatever we can do to impact and empower our students, that's what we should be doing. And so, we hope that you got that from us today. And we're so grateful for the opportunity to share with you.